Good morning. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University, and I am also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host today. For my part, I am really very excited about what I think will be a fresh discussion of competition and 5G. And when I utter those words, fresh, competition, and 5G, some of you may be a little skeptical because the discussion of competition and 5G has been part of the public discussion for months now. So in some ways, your skepticism is warranted. Indeed, if you were to look at, do an internet search, which I did, on the words competition and 5G, you'll get scores of hits. You'll get speeches, you'll get blog posts, you'll get academic articles, you'll get popular articles. So there are lots of people opining on the subject of competition and 5G. But if you look at those articles, speeches, blogs, what you'll see is that they all have an overwhelming consistency. The overwhelming consistency is that they talk about competition in a very mercantilist fashion. Now, what do I mean by competition in a mercantilist fashion? For those of you who are not steeped in 16th century economic history, let me back up just one moment and explain myself. If you'll remember from your schooling that in the 16th century, competition largely played out, and the discussion of competition largely played out around competition among city-states, among nation-states. England, Spain, Italy, Portugal, all were using, at that time, the vehicle of the high seas to compete for global economic success. And if you fast forward today to those articles, speeches, blogs I just discussed, what you will see is that they almost all have that same propensity. They discuss global economic success in the context of a discussion of competition among nation states. How is China going to fare relative to the United States? How is the U.S. going to fare relative to Europe? Those are important questions, no doubt about it. That's what's been in the news. What hasn't been in the news, what is missed by that discussion, is a set of competition questions that microeconomists especially tend to focus on as a matter of course. In this case, what will the development of 5G do to alter the competitive landscape for broadband delivery of broadband services? What will the development of 5G do to alter the competitive environment in the internet ecosystem more broadly? What will 5G do to enhance or alter the competitive landscape of the way goods and services across the economy are delivered? What public policies, what economic policies can be enacted or ought to be enacted today to complement and enhance that competition that is possible by 5G? Those are crucial, critical questions that to this point are still fresh and ripe for discussion. The stakes couldn't be any higher. Firms in the United States are spending tens of billions of dollars to develop 5G technology, and it's absolutely clear that the benefits of those investments are either going to be enhanced or diminished based on the answers to the questions I just laid out. So I, for one, am very, very excited about this discussion. I think it promises to be fresh. It involves both a panel and you. I looked at the list of people here. It's a marvelous list, and there are lots of experts in the audience that could and have, in fact, been on the dais here for the center in events in the past. So thank you all for coming. Let me not take any more time. I want to turn the panel over to my colleague, Carolyn Brandon, who is a Senior Industry and Innovation Fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, a student of the industry for a while now in telecommunications, wireless, internet, and is one of the great experts in the country. And I'll let her introduce what is truly a distinguished panel, and I think it promises to be a fresh discussion. Thank you very much for coming.
All All right, thank you all. I'm going to try to bring the conversation from 17th century up to 21st, and you guys can let me know if that's successful. Heat Dome has moved on, and I got a parking space right out front on Mass Ave at 9:40, so I think this is an auspicious start to our conversation today. Really wanted to, and again, thank you all for coming, because personally, when I hear 5G, I just kind of want to tune it out. It's sort of overtaken net neutrality as the most discussed topic these days that we all feel we've run out of things to say. However, when you take a look and hear from the experts that we have with us today, as John highlighted in his remarks, there are elements of understanding what 5G is and why it's relevant and what it portends for us as a country in our economy is not something that a lot of people have dug into, and I think we're going to cover that ground today in some depth. And I think maybe open up a new avenue of discourse about this topic called 5G. So we are joined, we have an economist who spent some time at the FCC taking a look at macro issues around spectrum and making more spectrum available, and sort of what does that mean when you get more spectrum into the hands of network operators, not just for the industry called wireless, but generally across the, as John said, the internet ecosystem. We're also joined by someone who is going to share her perspective on how all of this might redound to impact consumers, and not just from the perspective of consumer welfare. We are also joined by somebody who has spent time with folks developing software, very often categorized as the edge or the app economy. App economy really only talking about a very narrow subsection of what goes on within the software industry. And I think he's going to have some really interesting observations about what folks in that space are thinking about as they are making their business plans and knowing that they have access to this thing called 5G networks. And then certainly, not last and not least, and given that it's earnings season, really remarkable that she was able to get here from Chicago this morning, is somebody who has been analyzing and thinking about this industry for a long time. And I think what she's going to do is help us understand the financial implications of all of this stuff that we've been talking about, as well as to give us a sense of what the evolving business models are, not just from the people who provide broadband access, but folks who rely on those access connections and high-speed capabilities of 5G to do what they do. And before we get into the conversation and actually point out who's who here, I just wanted to call your attention to, there's two primers. We did not print them out for everybody here because we want to save some trees. But what we can do is we will make links available to folks who have RSVP'd, so all of you here in the room. This is a very in-depth look at 5G. It talks about the spectrum bands, it talks about the evolving business models, it talks about the history leading up to 5G and where it came from, as well as some ideas about where it might head in the future. So I'd highly recommend when you guys have a minute or two to take a look at both this and a second 5G primer that we were given by Wells Fargo. So Jen Fritchie, no surprise, is the gal I was talking about from Wells Fargo, financial analyst, managing director, and most impressive mom of multiple children, and somehow managed to get here from Chicago this morning. We've got Mark McCarthy, who is a fellow at Georgetown and most recently was with the Software Industry Association. We've got Anna Maria Kovacs, who is a scholar at Georgetown and has, I think many of you will have read her stuff in terms of analyst reports back in the day. She's also a long-term student and observer of the industry. And we have Parama, who is most recently with the Brattle Group, and before that was at the FCC in the Wireless Bureau. So without further ado, I was wondering if perhaps, Parama, you could set the framework for what we're talking about here. A quick refresher. We're not really going to get into the technology, what it is, how it operates. I'm assuming you guys have heard enough about that, understand it. If there are things you want to talk about offline in terms of the technical pieces, happy to talk to you about those questions. But I think we're just going to assume you already know what 5G is and take the conversation from there. But with that said, if you could just put this in context from a spectrum perspective and macroeconomic impact that I think you have spent some time researching and quantifying.
Sure, thank you. Couldn't help but start with a cartoon, if I can get it up, we'll see. what we want to do today, as Carolyn mentioned, is actually move a little bit away from what the cartoon actually depicts. The entire conversation has been about the global competitive edge, whether the US is losing the competitive edge, and the entire spectrum discussion has also been in terms of we are not doing enough mid-band, China is doing more mid-band, we're doing millimeter wave, are we losing an edge? And during this process, I think we are losing a lot of the actual discussions we should be having. And as Carolyn mentioned, I think for the panel today, our task is to refocus the discussion on what it is that US as a country can do and all of us who are students of this industry can do to move it forward. So very briefly, we've probably all seen this multiple times. 3 types of frequency, low, for the high frequency, pretend it's called mid-band, and then the millimeter wave band. Basically, if you think about what it looks like, the low frequency, which was supposed to be this, by the way, the spectrum trifecta is something that Tom Wheeler coined a while ago. I don't know if any of you are racing people. It's sort of a racing terminology. Basically said 5G for the first time uses all 3 types of spectrum. For the longest time at the FCC, when we were doing spectrum auctions, we used to talk about beachfront spectrum. And if you ever looked at any of our competition reports, the entire narrative was in terms of sub-1 gigahertz spectrum, beachfront, the value of that spectrum. And there wasn't enough attention paid even till about 2015 when we started thinking about sort of mid-band, 2 other kinds of spectrum. 5G has changed this conversation entirely. So with 5G, what are we talking about? We all think about sort of 5G, the Internet of Things. Is 5G and the Internet of Things the same? Second, sort of what is it about 5G that makes it very different from the 4G LTE connections? In my mind, it's sort of 3 basic things: very high speed, very low latency, and the ability to accommodate massive amounts of traffic. So if you're thinking of sort of in latency terms, it's about 1 millisecond. And sort of the example I often like to give is, suppose you're traveling in sort of these, a vehicle that's an autonomous vehicle. If you apply the brakes and there's 100 millisecond latency, the car moves about 10 feet. We cannot have that happen. Whereas with 5G, that is what is going to enable your connected cars and connected homes, especially things that are on the move where you cannot have a huge amount of latency. That's what 5G is going to enable for us today. So what it is that is going to make 5G successful? In my mind, there are 2 buckets that you can put it in. One is regulatory innovation, and the other is private innovation. So let's talk a little bit about the 2 very briefly. I know other panelists are going to talk more about this. So in regulatory innovation, there are basically 3 or 4 things that we might want to focus on when talking about 5G. The first is the Commission has moved ahead in thinking about sort of flexible use and sort of opportunistic use of the spectrum. And the first band that comes to mind is the CBRS, or the 3.5 gigahertz band. It sort of started in 2015, and that too after years of negotiation with the federal government agencies. And for the first time, this band had a very novel system of sharing. So the moment we think of sharing, CBRS comes to mind. It had 3 kinds of users: the priority access users, the general access users, and the unlicensed. And till today, there is technology being developed for dynamic sharing in this band, so that this flexible approach that the policymakers and the technologists came up with can actually be successfully implemented. In terms of so the economics and the policy, there are the SAS or the system administrators being set up to facilitate such a sharing mechanism. So that is definitely one of the big innovations in this policy arena that is going to bring more mid-band spectrum. One thing to remember that I think, for me, I used to often forget, a lot of the spectrum is not greenfield. There's somebody already in there. How do we make sure to accommodate that person both in terms of making them economically whole and also in terms of issues of interference? And the CBRS band, I think, is a poster child for that kind of sharing mechanism. The second regulatory innovation that we've all sort of heard a lot about in what the FCC has been doing in the past couple of years is flexible use. In flexible use, basically what the FCC is trying to do is say, look, given the current technology or given sort of the current use of bands and how efficiently you can use bands, you don't need the whole spectrum. Is there a way in which we can auction off a part of the spectrum and use it for terrestrial mobile? I won't get into the C-band debate, but a lot of the debate now is surrounding sort of the C-band and how much of the C-band can the satellite guys really give up for mobile terrestrial use. And there are a lot of other bands that are also being designated for flexible use. So in my mind, that's an extremely important development that is going to push 5G forward because there is a need for spectrum. And as somebody told me, last year it was all about millimeter wave, now it's mid-band, that's the sweet spot. So a lot of the discussion that you'll hear in terms of 5G is in terms of the mid-band. And one of the other reasons is, in terms of popular rhetoric, Europe, China, a lot of the other countries have deployed mid-band. The US till now has not deployed mid-band for 5G. A lot of it has been in terms of millimeter wave, and therefore there is a push to put more mid-band spectrum in 5G. The third innovation is the federal and non-federal sharing that goes partly to sort of the CBRS band and other bands that a lot of you are familiar with. And there is certain amount of inertia in part of federal agencies to share, especially Department of Defense, who sits on a fairly large chunk of spectrum, and there are very valid technical reasons. And I think the FCC and other agencies are working hard through the technical issues. There's this huge program called Sensor, which is trying to look into sharing bands, the NOAA band and the weather satellite band, very controversial issues, but there is a lot of effort to bring different kinds of spectrum into this 5G mix.
Can I just interject?
Yes.
And just remind the audience of one point, and that is one of the features of 5G is the ability to leverage what my daughter would call ginormous sized channels. So right now in the United States and around the world for the most part, before 5G, you had licenses for spectrum use that were relatively, quote, narrow. So a 20 megahertz license or a 10 megahertz license or a 5 megahertz license. What the engineers are now saying is that you need multiples of potentially hundreds of megahertz wide channels to really perfect the capability that is being built into 5G. So what I hear you saying is you have these innovations really on the technology of how you are able to use spectrum, but in part it's been driven at the regulatory level for the FCC to look at what rules it needs to modify to enable that because of the excitement and expected demand for these 5G family of services and network capabilities. Is that relevant?
Absolutely. Okay. And on the large channel size, I think that's an excellent point, because if any of you follow sort of the auctions, the 24 gigahertz auction, there's a marked difference between the 200 megahertz channels, the price they went for, it was, I think, a third of a cent, if I remember correctly, versus the 500 megahertz channel, which was like 1.2 cents. So huge difference between channel sizes which we have not seen before. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of potential for research, and Brattle is sort of looking into what it is that drives the value of these millimeter wave spectrum in 5G. It's nothing like we've seen before in the low or the mid bands. So very good sort of segue, I think, into the next point, which is, so what are the private innovations that will drive 5G. So some of the private innovations, obviously efficient spectrum use, dynamic spectrum sharing, there are all kinds of receiver performance issues. We've sort of heard about the 5G new radio and the software that goes along with it. I'm primarily going to focus on the first two things very briefly. So when we talk about efficient spectrum use, one of the first things when I was the FCC and we were talking about getting data from the providers, we were told the way you get data and coverage data and spectrum data does not make sense anymore. Now we have carrier aggregation. So when you tell me to report something by spectrum band, we are not sure what we have to report. And that was one of the first eye-openers for us, thinking about, okay, the landscape really has changed. And as regulators, I think at that point, a lot of us started rethinking what the landscape would look like. So the carrier aggregation is definitely in the forefront for a lot of cases. You see sort of the reuse and repurposing of low-band spectrum, such as the 600 megahertz, and its use in sort of as a 5G spectrum band. The 3.5 has these dynamic sharing issues, and there's technology that's being developed for that. And there's a whole issue about licensed, unlicensed, LTE-U, and how that fits into this entire thing. And I think 5G at its core is going to make sort of all this come together and deliver very fast speeds, low latency, and bring the Internet of Things together. To briefly close, as an economist, I sort of have to have an economic impact slide. Otherwise, I'm not doing my job. So the way I think about it, and this is sort of from me teaching like business classes at Brandeis and people telling me you always need a 2x2. Unless you have a 2x2, you're going to lose your MBA students. So this is my 2x2 for today. When I think about the economic impact, I think about it in sort of 4 dimensions. So on 2 dimensions, you have the direct and indirect economic effects. And along the horizontal dimension, you have things you can quantify really well and things that are not as easily quantifiable. So let's talk about the things that is a direct impact of sort of this spectrum and this 5G and what's quantifiable. So if we think about spectrum value, so recently at Brattle, we did sort of a valuation analysis where we valued sort of the spectrum bands, the legacy spectrum bands, including sort of till auction 102, at about like $505 billion, so about $500+ billion. And this is adjusting for, increase in supply, decreases in prices, maturity of bands, and all the factors that you can think about when you're thinking about what it is that drives the value of a spectrum band. So that's sort of a direct value that you can have. The second direct value is the revenues of the wireless industry and how 5G is going to affect the revenues of the wireless industry. The third is in terms of employment, just purely how much does the wireless industry employ. This is not your app economy. This is nothing else. This is just the direct impact of the wireless economy. The next is investment. How much are these companies investing? So currently, this is sort of to the tune of about $27, $28 billion a year. So that's sort of your direct impact bucket. The second impact, which is indirect, but we can still quantify it as economists, is I sort of tend to think about 2 things. It's multiplier effect. So in general, if you think about an input-output analysis, 1, what is the effect on things like consumer surplus? What is the effect on employment? So $1 spent in the wireless industry, how much employment does it generate elsewhere in the economy? So I think we had sort of an earlier paper that pegged it around 2015. It was about 7 jobs. For every job generated in the wireless industry, it generated 7 other jobs in other parts of the economy. Let's see. And in general, when we've estimated the multiplier, it's been about 10 to 20 times. So, in trillions of dollars, if you're thinking about how much the actual wireless industry sort of generates versus the total impact. And with 5G, this is only going to increase. So this is an extremely important sort of piece of the economy currently. In terms of the direct but non-quantifiable effects, there's a lot of innovation going on, as we know. Kind of hard to quantify the effect. You can look at sort of, patenting statistics, copyright statistics, and get at some of the innovation effects that way, and some of it does flow through sort of the entire economy as well. And sort of the non-quantifiable but indirect benefit is sort of this first mover advantage and sort of the potential impact. I've been thinking a lot about why are people concerned about the fact that US is not using mid-band and US is using only high-band spectrum. Is it really going to disadvantage us in a certain way? And while thinking about it, and there are experts who I would love to hear back from, it seems like that the millimeter wave, given its very low latency, is kind of the way to go in the future. So by not deploying millimeter wave aggressively in other parts of the world, in the future, all those apps that are being developed for the millimeter wave and the Internet of Things, the US might actually get a first mover advantage in all the technology that's related to the millimeter wave. So with that note, I will hand
Thank you
it
very,
over.
very much, and especially, and we'll make these slides available to everybody here as well. The point that you were making in the lower left quadrant, which is this first mover advantage, and sort of ties into John's point on nation states competing. And at the end of the day, I think there is broad agreement that the reason why you see and hear so much these days about US versus China, and we'll just, go right to one of the hot topics in the news these days, Huawei. Well, back in the day, it used to be Huawei was crappy equipment, and it was really cheap. Fast forward, Huawei equipment is actually really good and really cheap. And so being able to be the country that is setting the technical standards for equipment and building on a foundational level with your equipment, other people's 5G networks, provides you with economic opportunity that is definitely putting you as a country over in an advantageous position compared to other countries that are perhaps not in that role. So it's really less about the spying, et cetera, that motivates this conversation and focus, and it's really more about the business opportunities, not just for the telecom providers themselves, but across the economy, which is in large part responsible for this US v. China hot topic. Jen, can we roll over to you, and can you give us a sense, sort of what are you seeing the impact of 5G? I know there was many years where it was, this is the year of data, this is the year of data, this is the year of data, and I think everybody got tired of waiting for the year of the data, and then all of a sudden it sort of happened. I think 5G has been talked about for a couple of years, and yet we still do not have mass-produced phones that are 5G capable. And I think for your average consumer, other than seeing this in the headlines a lot, I think most people are like, all right, what's 5G going to do for me? Right. So can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing amongst the companies and industry sections that you're that you look
Sure.
at and think about, and then maybe share your thoughts about where you see 5G capability enabling maybe other parts of the economy beyond just the tech and telecom space.
Sure, sure. So first, thank you both for having me. It's a great honor to be here. But 5G, yeah, it's kind of the buzzword certainly these days, but how it shapes the maybe just dividing your question into consumer and enterprise. For consumer, if you're a T-Mobile customer or not, you should write John Ledger a thank you note because of that, because your bills have come down if you're an AT&T, Verizon, or Sprint user because of the disruptive nature of T-Mobile's aggressive pricing that they've done. And I just say that because we've almost been desensitized to think that our wireless bills are going down, not up. So as you get a new 5G phone, I personally think it's going to be really hard to convince the consumer, especially the younger consumer, millennial, to run out and pay, pick your number, $10 to $15 more per month for a faster, low latency speed. That's going to be a hard sell. It's going to be a different type of service that's going to have to appeal to the consumer. And to your point on the handsets, really the year of the data didn't come till June of 2007 when the first iPhone model came out. And so that you really are waiting on the devices to drive that acceptance. So that's kind of a hard place to be. For enterprise, I think it's a very different story. I think that I'm definitely in the AT&T camp where they believe that enterprise is going to be the first to embrace 5G. And you look at things like CBRS that Paroma mentioned that is already, there's so many enterprises, I think there's publicly stated about 80 to 90 that are already testing CBRS, yet the spectrum isn't really fully available. That gives us a very interesting insight as to the carrier. The enterprises are very much looking for ways to use 5G to make themselves more efficient. Now that is easy to say, but that there's so many layers of that. It's probably, very specific to each different enterprise silo. Like banking that I'm in is going to be very different than consumer or auto, but all with making it more efficient. For consumer, I think it's going to be, I'll call them like little niche-y products initially. When I was at Mobile World Congress, someone was actually the Verizon booth was displaying, AR and VR are definitely pegged as consumer products for 5G. And they modeled, if your child has a peanut allergy, for example. I don't have my phone with me, but you just go down the grocery aisle, and instead of taking out your glasses and reading the label of that, it will just say, no, move on, if you just barcode it. And is that something as a mother that we'd pay $8 for a month? Most definitely. So I think there's going to be thousands of examples like that, but it's probably going to be very niche-y products. In terms of your question as to who's winning first, we write this in our primer, but it's a chicken and egg scenario in that, I don't know, the egg doesn't come till that chicken is built, and that chicken in this scenario is the infrastructure. So think of things like fiber, small cells, spectrum we talked about. Those are the initial winners here because the train has already left the station. AT&T's already marketing around 5GE. I have many friends who think that they already have 5G, even though they really don't. But that carrier, that they cannot have 5G till that infrastructure is laid.
So just to go back, just to kind of bring it full circle here, and again, I'm cheating from the slide deck that we'll make available to everybody. In terms of the use cases, and that's always a challenge, right? In part, what we have to do for folks inside the Beltway, especially folks on the Hill and at the agencies, is to capture, their attention. And I think I've often been asked, yeah, I get the whole remote, autonomous vehicles, and I get remote surgery. What else is going to be out there that's actually really cool that we will be able to do with 5G that we can't do now? And I was wondering, are there anything you've seen or companies like, I know you just said for the consumer side, it's really going to be more niche products. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the use cases, anything across automotive, healthcare, transportation, or any of the other sort of most likely to be leveraging 5G for more efficiency?
It's such an open question. I mean, the low latency is huge, and so how that manifests itself. I mean, I think Verizon is doing a very interesting thing on the consumer. They're going right after the heart of the cable business. So if you think of their fixed wireless initiative, which essentially is taking fiber close to my home and then using for that last 2,000 feet millimeter wave, I mean, that has real implications for the cable business. I mean, if Verizon is successful, we're essentially talking about the uncabling of cable. And so if cable is really focused on broadband, what does that mean for them? Which it offers like going down the decision tree of thought. If you're Comcast, who we know is very smart, do you want to be in a wireless partnership with someone like Verizon through an MVNO? If they're going after your core business, or do you say, Uncle, I'm going to shift and own wireless in a more formal way? Mm-hmm. So that's like one example.
I mean, I know that there have been some raised eyebrows as to the virtue of various ISPs getting into the content business, but from the uneducated observer, obviously that strategy is not predicated on 5G per se, but do you see 5G as being giving some of these companies the ability to step into those sorts of market areas that they have not really engaged in and sort of become a disruptor in the entertainment business and potentially be a disruptor in then, fill. I don't see AT&T getting into the garbage disposal business, but, as a general matter, beyond just providing a broadband connection, does it open the door for these sorts of companies who are building the 5G networks to get into other stuff?
Yes, and I think we saw that with AT&T through their purchase of Time Warner. And that, AT&T, as I watch my own kids consume content, I actually think they're really onto something. But AT&T has somewhat of a heroic task in front of them, that they have to prove that owning the pipe and owning the content gives them an advantage versus Amazon, Netflix, et cetera. So, Netflix has made a lot of money on riding on my guys' pipes that they haven't had to pay to build out. So I think that is going to be a real open question for AT&T. If they can prove it, they have made the right bet. If they can't, then I would say Verizon's made the right bet, because they're essentially doubling down on a network and future-proofing their network in a fiber-centric sort of way.
I thought, we will move on, I promise.
No problem.
I don't mean to focus on you so much. But I thought it was interesting the sorts of companies you were listing as whether or not AT&T could compete with them, and I think the same holds true for Verizon, are folks like Amazon. Not something that 5-10 years ago people would normally put into a conversation about who are the ISPs competing with. I don't know that most folks were thinking about Amazon as being in that space.
Right.
So I think that also begins to answer the big picture question, which is, will the network technology itself enable different kinds of business models and different kinds of competition? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
Yes, I firmly believe that, but it's just how it shakes out, I think,
Exactly.
is the question.
So Mark, sitting quietly over there,
That's about to change.
coming from the software perspective, or I guess first and foremost, what do you think 5G, let's just assume ubiquitous 5G networks around the country, relevant at all to your former colleagues? Are they aware of it? Are they thinking about it? How is this relevant to them, if at all?
You remind me of the old economist joke, which has the economist in a desert island and no way to open up the cans of food that are around, so he just says, assume a can opener. So assume we've got the ubiquitous network everywhere, then what? So anyhow, thank you for having me, and John especially, and it's good to see so many familiar faces out here. I asked some friends of mine over the weekend. I told them I was going to do this, and I said, so what do you think 5G is good for? And they looked at me and blinked, and one of them said, well, how about friends in the metro? I said, well, okay. But I do think that's at least part of it. I mean, 5G could potentially allow you to download a 2-hour movie in 3.6 seconds. 4G, it's 6 minutes. And so from the point of view of the consumer, that's the difference between 100 megabits per second and 10 gigabits per second. So it really is going to make a difference in speed. But I'm going to focus on the benefits that come from a different feature, which is that they allow for a massive increase in connected devices at lower latency. And that really means talking about smart connected devices, both for homes and for business. And we touched on this a little bit before, but you've already got the smart house. You've got the light bulbs and the thermostats and the security cameras and the refrigerators and the mattresses and the smart speakers and the bathroom scales and all that stuff.
Don't forget about the Pampers.
Don't forget about the Pampers. They'll tell you
new
when you need
last
to
week.
renew. And so there'll be more of that, and it'll extend to mobile. There might be mobile virtual reality or augmented reality applications, but it'll be largely the niche products that were just mentioned. Probably more interesting, maybe more important from the point of view of the actual launch is the enterprise IoT, where you have smart connected devices, but they're in the workplace. So this will really enable a massive increase in the decentralized mobile workplace, where you can have huge increases in productivity with people connected in real time. In manufacturing, you'll have industrial automation, energy, utilities, agriculture, defense. All of these areas of our industry will benefit from the increased speeds and the lower latency and the massive capacity of 5G. So from the point of view of software, what you're seeing is the massive spread of computers. Computers will be everywhere. And what do computers need? Computers need to be programmed. Computers need software. And so this is a huge opportunity for for the industry. What I want to do, instead of detailing the products that might be coming, because that really is only limited by the imagination of the people involved, I want to focus on some of the policy issues and concerns that may, if they're not addressed properly, create some barriers to the expansion of this. The first one is safety. Connected computers are now in mission-critical applications. If your connected insulin pump or your pacemaker goes down, that's actually a lot more serious than if your bookseller makes a mistaken book recommendation for you. So accuracy and reliability of the system and the software that's involved in it really becomes key. A second issue is information security, not the Russians spying on us or the Chinese spying on us, although we'll get to that. This is the exposure to 5G connected devices creates another vector of attack, not just on the device, but on all the devices that it's connected to. And it's not just theft of information that's a worry. It's the safe operation of the systems. The malicious actors don't want to just steal things. They want to change the operation of things so that they become dangerous or unreliable. And that's a huge, huge security situation that has to be dealt with. These systems are expensive to develop, and there's a possibility that companies will be tempted to skimp on security, which would not be a very good thing for them or for our country. Bruce Schneider, who many of you know is a security expert, he has a great and a scary book on this topic with a clickbait title, and it's called Click Here to Kill Everyone. And it's about the security risks of connected devices. And he recommends a dedicated information security agency with authority to prescribe standards. Something like that might actually be necessary, you know, if the industry is going to get off the ground in a safe fashion. Liability issues. You know, these are complex systems. They're not just simple devices that can easily go wrong in a limited and confined way. They're complex systems with tight integration, and accidents are to be expected, even normal. And so whose responsibility is it when something goes wrong? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the software designer? No, of course not. Is it the user? Is it the connectivity provider? We've seen this discussion begin with autonomous vehicles, and we've seen proposals because of the problem associated with attributing causality when these systems go wrong for no-fault insurance, where everybody involved throws money into a pot, and people who have been damaged by a problem get to be compensated in that way. Control of data. You know, everyone's been talking about the massive increase of information that will flow from these connected devices. Who gets to use it? Same series of possibilities. It's the manufacturer, the software designer, the connectivity provider. Maybe user control would be, you know, ideal, and the privacy rules will get to that. And that raises the privacy and surveillance issues. Companies are going to want to track people and things, and that raises the privacy issue. But governments, of course, are going to want to keep track of people of interest, possible terrorists or criminals. What are the rules? Again, it may not make ultimate sense to put the decisions on this purely in the hand of the ultimate user. People have talked about the conflict with China. All I have to do is say Huawei and ZTE, and that's all you need to say. But there are, to conclude, some competition policy issues. John raised the question whether this will create new opportunities for competition. And of course it will. I mean, lots of companies will be trying to get into the game and provide products and services in vigorous competition with each other. But there are some economic factors that could lead to difficulties, and I think competition authorities need to be alert to them. It is an industry with massive scale economies. There will be customization that will be based on product usage data, and network effects will be present in the market. These will all tend to favor big companies. And they'll also create barriers to expansion, switching, and entry. And so these might create the economic problem of concentration and consolidation in the market. Even if it starts off vibrantly competitive, these forces might very well lead to economic problems down the line. People are already beginning to think about antitrust remedies like data portability or data sharing and interoperability as ways to get ahead of those particular problems. So let me stop there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. Anna Maria, how is all of this, do you think, going to impact your average consumer? Aside from having access to a plethora of niche products, which I think is now a new term, help us understand how all of this gets boiled down.
I think the primary use is clearly going to be video. That's where most of the data is going to be. And to translate latency and speed, essentially what you're talking about is very rapid downloads with no buffering, effectively. So it becomes a lot more appealing, particularly to do mobile use, as has been said before. There are other uses which are arguably in many ways more important, but are not going to be using as much of the network, things like robotic surgery, for example, which has been mentioned. You don't want any buffering when you are doing neurosurgery remotely. And for rural areas particularly, the ability to access surgeons in major metro areas, in community hospitals, which don't have those kinds of surgeons, could be very important. So there are a number of life-saving uses that are going to be possible. Clearly, for things like autonomous driving, that could be very important to senior citizens who at some point are no longer driving themselves and perhaps don't want to rely on Uber, Lyft, or others. So that, again, becomes one form of potential competition where machines can take over some things that are currently being done by people, but at the same time, other jobs are getting created. And that concept of independent living, all of the connected home stuff, again, the monitoring, all of those things, I think become very important to folks who, who are relying on others to make sure that they're safe at home. So all of this translates for consumers into a much better lifestyle in a lot of ways if you are able to solve some of the problems that Mark described. And I think for most people, for most consumers, the two that are most obvious are the issues of security, cybersecurity. You do not want your household hacked, much less, your entire power grid. And the issue, which is receiving a lot of attention these days in Washington, which is the issue of privacy. Right now, what we have is a huge patchwork of privacy legislation coming from the states primarily, to some extent from Europe, all of which is defining things differently and making it very difficult for both businesses and consumers to have any idea of what their rights are, what their responsibilities are, what needs to be done. So happy to talk about that some more as we go on.
So I could sit up here by myself all day and trap these kind folks and have a great conversation, but I wanted to take a pause and see if there was anyone who had any questions based on what we've covered so far. Sure, go ahead. And if you could just quickly identify, we're taping it, so if you could identify yourself and your affiliation.
Sure. Andy Schwartzman, Benton Foundation. I find it, I want to ask about the race to 5G, and if there is really a race to 5G, or what are we racing for? It seems to be a consensus that we really don't know what the use case is for 5G yet. We think it's going to, video will obviously be involved, but we think it may be enterprise. It may provide a competition for a fixed wireless competition for wired connectivity. It may help in rural places. It obviously will help in telemedicine. But we don't know exactly how, and we don't know exactly what technology is going to be involved. So is this a matter of build it and they will come? Or is this something where maybe we might be better off letting the technology develop before we rush into deploying what may be the wrong thing or the wrong standard?
Just having lived through multiple iterations of the evolution of wireless, certainly people would dispute that they, quote, rolled out the wrong thing. Here I'm thinking of a particular company that was enamored with, I think it was TDMA back in the day. Didn't really go anywhere, kind of a misstep, might have blown a couple $1,000,000 or a couple hundred. What I have seen the industry do, because it is so competitive at such a deep level, going into even the personal relationships some of these executives have vis-a-vis each other, I feel that the technology can be deployed, and if there's a mistake, you can easily overcome it. And when I say easily, I don't mean for free or very, very quickly, but it's certainly something that you can overcome and, quote, recover from. But on the other hand, it seems to me that we are talking about a lot of use cases that are actually happening now, and IoT being one of them. IoT, of course, doesn't need 5G to be a success, but all of the extension ideas about how to use IoT beyond the obvious seem to be definitely a use case that's not in the future, but is happening now. And then as far as and I'm going to let the experts here jump in, but I didn't want to leave the impression that this, quote, race to 5G versus China is really nothing more than a slogan. Having looked at the way in which China has deployed and pursued its One Belt, One Road initiative, and the way in which they are putting resources in their economy behind several key areas, including tech and telecom, as a way to position the country as the global leader across a number of ways, I do not think it is a light matter. I don't think it's a trivial matter, and I don't think it's a made-up issue. I think it's very, very real. Whether or not we are going to have the ever-expanding economy like we've experienced over the last 100 years, or whether that, all of the benefits that come from that go to some other country. And I think that's what, in part, the race is about, but I could be wrong. Anna Marie.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is if you go back to pre-iPhone, the internet, the way we know it today, essentially began with the iPhone, and no one would have predicted before that most of the uses that we have today. So at some point, you've got to have the technology out there for the innovators to actually play with and work with and come up, with the solutions.
Yeah, I think that's the answer. You can't describe to me in great detail the actual technology that will be using this infrastructure, and then I'll build it. Because, it's like any entrepreneur knows this. People don't know what they want until, some entrepreneur shows it to them. And so you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith in this area. And for the infrastructure companies who are involved in this, it's a huge leap of faith. And this is expensive stuff. And there's a distinct possibility they'll put all this investment in there, and the customers won't come. The field of dreams will collapse. But I do think, the experience of 4G shows that kind of leap in the dark, it can be very successful. The U.S. took the lead in that area. We were successful in having huge spillover effects for the rest of the economy, including the tech giants who are in such trouble these days. But that kind of forward-looking innovation in a brand new technology with a lot of promise is the kind of stuff that I think we would be doing and likely to be doing regardless of competition with China. I don't think this is something we're being pushed into because of external forces telling us that we have to go there, otherwise we'll be left behind in some race. I think it's an internally generated opportunity that the technology is presenting to us, and we really don't have much of a choice but to go for it.
The other, and this will be the last comment, some of the innovations, Parma, that you were talking about with respect to spectrum, the idea that you could figure out a way to bend a radio wave around the corner of a building was laughable 10 years ago. And yet, right now, that's what people actually are trying to figure out how to do in millimeter wave to make it even more useful. So the sorts of things that are going on that I think engineers get really, really, really excited about are not necessarily going to be the customer-facing things that we as non-engineers are like, oh my God, that is so cool. Although I do think bending radio waves is sort of cool. You know, generally they go this, they don't normally go like that. Anyway, I was an English major. Little things really, really impress me in this space. But I just think that there is a lot going on here that, again, is not necessarily terribly exciting to most of us, but is critical. Another, I think, space that would presumably be affected a lot, and I just don't hear a lot, I don't hear much coming from Wall Street about it, is the insurance industry. You know, think about big data combined with, and let's not go in a scary place like healthcare, just, you know, insuring your home. And if you have a smart connected home, are there ways to price things a little bit differently than the way they used to be? And that's just one of the very preliminary questions. So I tend to be not an advocate here, but I just have spent so much time in the wireless space, and it has always held so much promise, and I think there's nothing about 5G that would cause us to think that it won't continue to deliver. Other questions? Yes. Oh, wait, you have to wait so that we can record your lovely voice. And if you could identify yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Shane Tews of the American Enterprise Institute. So Anna Marie and Mark, you both mentioned security. So where is the right place to work through these security issues? Is it in the network stack? Is it through the multi-stakeholder process? Does the government have a role here? That seems to be the big challenge. And with the opening cartoon about the, you know, the Huawei ring, obviously this has got layers of interest to it.
I'm a fan of Schneiders' approach, which is this is an area where you do need some government role. The externalities are too great. The chances of you not making an investment that would cause problems for other people, and the misalignment of financial incentives suggests that if you don't have some external force putting some pressure on companies to make adequate investments, it just won't be done. So I do think you need that kind of regulatory oversight. The chances of getting that in the current environment, you know, I'm a little skeptical, but I do think it's a necessity. And if you don't get it, there'll be serious problems that could set back the industry for years. And then maybe then, but maybe not. You'll move ahead with a regulatory approach, and that's really very different from the Chinese threat. I mean, I know we describe it as China might be snooping on us, but this is much more just the vulnerabilities made possible by the software developers and the others who make the products that will ride on top of 5G, that they don't put the adequate security in there, and that. Even if you got rid of all of Huawei's products and never use ZTE ever again in your entire life, and those companies vanished from the face of the earth, we would still have those problems. So it's really a separate problem, and one that should be dealt with a proactive government role.
And I think, I mean, as has been the case for decades now, the networks play a huge role and have played a huge role in security, and certainly in the last couple of decades, as PCs and mobile devices have proliferated, the responsibility to some extent has extended to individuals, particularly when we see how much damage can be done, witness Target and any number of others, where one small supplier, for example, can cause havoc for a huge corporation and millions of users. So really, at all levels, it's got to be done, and there's got to be, and folks have to be accountable for that.
How about Howard and then Mr. Peha?
Howard Buskirk with Communications Daily. You haven't talked much about, I mean, I think most of the focus has more or less been on licensed spectrum and 5G, but I wanted to ask you about how licensed spectrum will sort of interplay with wireless spectrum, and also what's the outlook for getting some bigger channels, for example, in the unlicensed space. There's been a lot of focus on 6 gigahertz, but it seems like that's also a very crowded band. So the I'm not sure what the outlook is as far as how quickly that might be available. So that's the question, or the questions.
So if you look at sort of the December auction that's upcoming, you do have very large channels in that auction. We saw that in the 24 gigahertz auction as well. So in the millimeter wave, definitely there are larger channels that are coming online. And in terms of sort of more unlicensed spectrum coming online, I think that is an area that is actively being explored in a lot of bands, and not just sort of the CBRS that everyone sort of talks about. In the 5.9 gigahertz, there's been a lot of debate about whether you should open up a bit of the band for Wi-Fi-like uses. It is a very controversial issue, but one that we need to visit often, given the architecture of what 5G is going to look like.
I just note on spectrum, I would agree that there is this whole conversation about C-band and mid-band. I mean, I think it is ironic that 2 years ago we were talking about 2.5 as high-band spectrum, and it's now fully in the mid-band area. But there is this, I would agree with, I think the point Param was making, that the millimeter wave spectrum might be underappreciated here. I mean, I think Verizon's purchase of Straight Path, the history books are going to show that was a extremely wise strategic move to outbid AT&T, because if this works, and there's a lot of evidence about the data it can carry, or the traffic it can hold given the wideband of channels they have, I think they're in a very envious spot for a future 5G network. And in my world, there's a lot. I'll sit down in a meeting with with a hedge fund manager, and they'll tell me how Verizon's extremely vulnerable in their spectrum position, how they need a lot of mid-band, and make them feel like they're in a position of extreme weakness. I think they'll certainly be interested in C-band if it becomes available, but I don't think they're anywhere nearly as vulnerable as people might think.
Speaking of spectrum.
I was going to ask about something different, though. But in a discussion,
Name and affiliation.
oh, sorry, John Peacock, Carnegie Mellon University. In a discussion of competition, I'm wondering about who the competitors are, right? In a 4G world, I'm used to thinking about 4 cellular operators and some smaller ones, and 2 tower companies and some smaller ones. Are there going to be new kinds of competitors in a 5G infrastructure world?
I'll just take that. I mean, when you get my primer, we have a little cartoon in there that shows that, the broadband network is an extremely part of, the long pole in this tent of 5G is the fiber provider. And so you have the wire, as I always call them, the wireless and wireline CapEx dollars. That line is becoming a lot more blurred. AT&T no longer breaks out traditional wireless CapEx spending. Verizon going forward will no longer. And that's because they're so interrelated. So I think fiber providers, for those of you who might know Zayo, a company that just is going to be taken private, there were 16 bids for Zayo. A lot of private equity money is chasing this space. I would, some of these, what we used to call RLECs, rural local exchange providers, have been left for dead. Names like CenturyLink, which is the largest fiber provider, used to be part of, it bought Level 3. I think that's going to be a really interesting model, because the fiber is the kind of the key ingredient in the cookie. You can't make cookies without eggs, and I think of fiber as those eggs.
Just to pick up on something that I've heard, certainly you and your colleagues use, Jen, is this issue of the DOJ review of the proposed Sprint T-Mobile merger, and this idea that perhaps there can be a synthetic fourth competitor created through sort of cutting off some of the assets of the combined company and kind of creating this additional fourth competitor if the existing go from 4 to 3. And what to me is fascinating about that, putting aside where DOJ lands, is the rumors about the sorts of partners that are in discussions with various parties that appear to be in front of the DOJ. Partners like, an Amazon or a Google. These are companies who certainly have the money to get into the spectrum business, but probably are smart enough to realize actually putting sticks in the ground is a long, hard, expensive slog to having access or being able to have a service that you might want to provide access to consumers or bundle it into something else you're doing. But to me, that is a reality that highlights that this does open up the possibility for different and interesting kinds of competitors. Maybe they're not going to be competing the way traditional phone companies looked and felt in the way they competed, but certainly would be in a position to start nibbling at market share of not only the operators, but jumping the shark and getting into completely different parts of the industry. Seem to be possible. Whether or not that's actually going to happen, I think remains to be seen, but it's really an excellent question.
The other piece is, how are you defining competition? If you look at, for example, at CapEx, among some of the large edge providers, it has been growing phenomenally in the last few years as they have taken over. They have essentially become CDNs. They've bought endless amounts of data centers, put fiber between them, and are sort of integrating backward into the core network, perhaps ultimately. So the way the network is configured, and it makes sense because they have all that data that is being transported. So it really comes down to kind of, when do these guys want scale? Where are they going to find it? And above all, how long do their valuations remain as astronomical as they are? And the phenomenal amounts of cash that are sitting on their balance sheets that enable them to fund, to fund back into the network side.
And, I would be remiss if we didn't also throw out names like Legato is out there trying to figure out a path to success, however they define success, which is a little unclear to me. You've got Rivada, which is out there, unclear what their path to success will be, but you definitely have a lot of entities out there that are not your traditional network operators and providers who seem to recognize there's some value here with this thing called 5G, and maybe they haven't figured out exactly how they want to plug into it, but definitely seem to be very interested. And again, rumor mill, if you look at who was rumored to be talking to Rivada on partnering on devices, et cetera, again, not your usual folks that you read about being in this space. So I remain hopeful that, in fact, we will see different kinds of competition and very different sorts of companies, quote unquote, getting into the wireless game, if you will. Any other questions? Yes, please. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself.
It's Aiden Hennessy from the Federal Communications Commission. Sort of picking back off of that, so when you talk about competition, just to kind of take it to more kind of macro scale here on international commerce, like what kind of like policy or like trade agreement like policy would help kind of create a competitive structure? Because when you talk about when we rolled out 4G as a base for that, well, when we rolled out 4G, it was like the sort of the start of like the internet of all things, and you have much more entry. And like with 5G, like you're at a point now where it's like all the companies in like US and Europe have just such a massive like capital endowment that like they're just going to be able to, and while it might seem like good policy for them, like what about like people in like Guatemala or like all these developing countries that are trying to get their sort of wire industry kickstart? Like what does that mean for them? And like, or even just here in the US, sort of with all these, now you have all these companies that have such a massive capital endowment that they're going to be able to buy into 5G a lot easier. Like how would it help sort of, how would you structure kind of a policy that would create an equal competitive framework for that?
So if I understand the question correctly, what does all of this mean for purposes of bringing wireless broadband to either areas that don't currently have it, I think your example, or have a weak wired infrastructure, so your Guatemala example. As a general matter, and folks with economic degrees after their name rather than a law degree should step in here because I'm about to skate out into trying to pretend I'm an economist. However, one of the interesting developments around 5G is the drop in the cost factor. While you have to put up a lot more sites, pieces of equipment. They generally tend to be a little bit less expensive than the pieces of equipment you had to deploy in prior iterations. So if the ultimate cost factor is going down, the theory is that you then, as a company, have the ability potentially to go out into areas that will not necessarily give you the ROI that Wall Street is expecting you to get when you are investing your cash. But because the cost has gone down, perhaps you can go after those opportunities a little bit more robustly. And I certainly think here in the US, the conversation around 5G and a focus of the FCC has been, how can 5G bring more wireless broadband to areas of the country that either don't have it or don't have a lot of competition? So I think there are a lot of policies in terms of USF reform, the mobility fund, infrastructure siting, towers, you name it. I think all of that is actually in play right now to bring this to areas sooner and faster. And in terms of internationally, John, you might be able to speak to this. There have been some experiences, and certainly Mexico was one of them, where the wired infrastructure is either minimal or non-existent, but you can bring wireless there. And that won't give you the fiber connections that you're going to need for a robust 5G experience, but it certainly is going to get you wireless access to the internet where, if you waited for the actual wired infrastructure to reach some of these areas, it just wouldn't happen because it's too expensive. But that was, generally my sense. Do you guys have anything?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Especially you touched on the mobility fund. That's been one of the cornerstones of the FCC to push out wireless broadband to more unserved and underserved areas. Currently, if you follow, it's been in a bit of a hiatus because of certain mapping and coverage issues and exactly where those unserved and underserved areas is. So it's kind of funny that in an area where we're talking of big data and connected data, we still struggle with thinking about what is unserved and what is underserved and trying to figure out exactly what those areas are that most deserve public subsidy.
And I'm sorry.
Yes,
On
Professor.
the question that was raised about economic policies, and just to try to connect a couple of dots, one of the things that has consistently been talked about is all of the activity that's going on in the spectrum space. If you just back it up one layer, the reason we're having this discussion is because spectrum is a vital, necessary resource. Without that spectrum, you'll get limited supply and higher prices. That's something that is critically important. Jennifer also mentioned the idea that you might have companies like Verizon doing fixed wireless invading the space of other competitors. As a public policy matter, you want to enable that, not to discourage it. You also have seen over the last year or two discussions of removing public barriers to entry that involve the new technology of building microcells and the deployment of those cells on street lights and street corners and towers and buildings. All of that will be necessary. And then I think we can't forget at the end of the day, Mark's caveat, we don't really know yet whether all of that's going to play out in the form of somebody getting a first mover advantage in our sort of capitalist system. Unlike China, we have a lot of different players competing. We don't know if there's going to be one dominant firm that's going to provide leadership and perhaps be able to take advantage of a undue competitive advantage. So you've got to have a backstop technology or a policy of competition policy through the FTC and the DOJ. Just some thoughts.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? No, it is 11:20. I think we can talk further or we can call it a day. I can give you guys back, let me put it this way, I can give you guys back 10 minutes of your life because we were supposed to end at 11:30, or we can continue talking. I think,
Let me just wind up
yes,
with one
please,
question,
Mark.
one comment. I do think it's important to shift the discussion a little bit away from the carriers and the broadband and the infrastructure and focus on what 5G will do for the connected smart products and devices. That really is the name of the game. People people won't buy 5G unless they have something to use on it. It's a platform. It's not an end in and of itself. And I do think it provides the opportunity for these connected smart devices to change the nature of the products themselves and to change the way companies compete. I mean, you are going to have a product that is not an isolated product. It's got a computer on board, and they can talk to other computers. And that really does change the way in which companies will be in this game. For one thing, a company like John Deere will not be in the tractor business anymore. It will be in the business of providing agricultural systems. And that kind of shift from individual products to systems is going to happen in area after area after area. It's not just in the telecom section that we need to be focused on these changes. And it's there that I think we have to be most worried about the possibilities for competition effects that might be damaging. Because these systems are going to be very large, they're going to be very complex, and there will be scale effects, there will be barriers to entry, and the possibilities of concentration are pretty real. If you add to that the customization effects that will come from all these product data that's being thrown out, and the possibility of being able to say to people, I know exactly how you're using this product, and I can build it customized for you, and nobody else can do that because I've got the data. That also creates a barrier to entry. And the network effects do it as well. Big companies with lots of customers have a lot more products that they can analyze to improve the products, find out how they're working, how to make sure they don't break down, when they might break down, when repair and maintenance is due. All of those things become more and more important as you get more and more customers. So once again, big companies have an advantage over small companies. Those effects on market structure, I think, have to be watched, they have to be waited for, they have to be anticipated, and policymakers should be thinking now how to get ahead of it and to think of policies that might mitigate those problems.
I would just add just a last kind of tagline in line with Mark's comment. When I was walking around Mobile World Congress floor in Barcelona, I got the best explanation of 5G that I could get from like a RF engineer that I just actually met while walking the floor. And his description, I had to write it down, was that whereas every other G, the business case drove connectivity, 5G, you kind of flip the script. And it's the connectivity is going to be so massive that it's going to drive multiple business cases that we don't really even know exist. Now, I'm also kind of the 5G pixie dust is everywhere. But when you think about it in that respect and really echoing Mark's comments, I think that kind of summarizes it. And going back to your original question, that's why AT&T, that's why Verizon, that's why T-Mobile, Sprint, et cetera, need to make that investment. Because the economic numbers for just America in general are massively big.
But I think also, when you look at that interconnectedness, that's why federal policy on privacy and federal legislation sooner rather than later is really critical, because you're going to need all of that data to be, you need the companies to be able to trust and understand what their responsibilities are. You need consumers to be able to understand that. Exactly. You need to figure out, you know, who owns what, who is responsible for that. So I think we'd have a really hard time if that doesn't happen quickly.
Yes.
And what we did not talk about today is, which I think could be the focus of our next gathering, is you take 5G and you overlay AI, and what does that look like? And usually those conversations are a little scary, so we'll leave that for a different day. But I would leave you with this thought. So there was a guy who thought, wow, I think I can figure out a way that we're gonna have mass-produce electric cars. And I think that person also decided there's got to be a way we can go ahead and get to Mars, which then drove innovations in battery, is driving innovations in some of the spectrum discussions. And most recently, he's decided he wants to figure out a way to get a chipset connecting your devices to your brain. It sounds funky. It sounds strange. I think it sounds creepy. The point is that sort of focus on something really creative and innovative is obviously driven not just by things that CEO wants to accomplish, but it's also driven, I think, in no small part by the technical capabilities of today's modern broadband infrastructure, and that's really exciting. So we don't have a short answer to exactly what are we racing towards, and is this just made up speech? But I do think there is real excitement, and 5G, everyone you talk to, whether it's the engineer, the marketing folks, the device people, the network folks, they're just really excited. And I think they're excited by the fact that they've got something really cool here, not really sure what it's going to accomplish, but it should be really exciting. So with that, thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you for the speakers. And John, any other? Thank you for coming. All right, thank you.